the skin was not lacerated or torn. If you hit somebody with something like a 2x4 or a hammer or a flashlight, it tears the skin. This has to be something flat.
This is another obvious reason why the crime, the collage theory essentially of JonBenet stealing a piece of pineapple and then being struck over the head with a flashlight, why it doesn't make any sense, because as you've just heard, there was no break in the skin, and the only thing that could create a situation like that is something that is somewhat elastic, something that would dispel energy in an even way and not actually break the skin. And that does not include something like a flashlight or, for that matter, a golf club. And so where does that leave us?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The stagers forgot to stage something else. Now, let's assume for the moment that we don't know who wrote the ransom note. And let's also assume we don't know what the grand jury indictments say about attempting to hinder an investigation, which could also be interpreted as staging. What if the stagers, whoever they were, realized at a certain point, besides the ransom note, they needed a corroborating sign of forced entry, because the insider narrative wasn't going to wash indefinitely. It wasn't going to work once it turned out the handwriting of the ransom note didn't match either of the suspects that had been fingered, Linda Hoffman Pugh or Jeff Merrick. Could it be that once the authorities communicated their unsuccessful efforts to locate a point of forced entry, someone, upon reflection, someone quietly listening, elected to provide one? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. By the way, in the Amanda Knox case, Amanda has just, through her lawyers, just given notice that she's going to appeal the reconviction for slander. It's interesting, it's not really making the news in America. It's only in one publication thus far. Also, we are 2 weeks away from the 17-year anniversary of that particular incident. And bear in mind, the Amanda Knox case is actually an unsolved case. The judges felt that Rudy Gaudet didn't act alone, but he's the only person who has been convicted and sentenced in this particular crime. For those interested in the Knox case, I am covering the chronological timeline on X under the hashtag 17 years ago today MK. You can go to X, put those terms in the search bar, that is hashtag 17 years ago today MK. Do the search and then click on the tab latest to find my thread there. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, you can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, I did say early on that I was going to give you my theory on this whole window enigma, and this is essentially part 2 to it. It goes into a little bit more detail. It's a little bit more, I would say, comprehensively thought out. Now, a cohesive theory integrates all the evidence and then synthesizes a sensible scenario. Clearly, you have to have talent and skill and attention to detail to separate all of this wheat from the chaff. And that is where you come in. You get to evaluate if the hypothesis proposed here integrates sufficiently and synthesizes correctly. Of course, you can't do that effectively without having a fairly substantial knowledge and background, really a grounding of this case to begin with. I want to begin by grounding my hypothesis in what we know. And that is, well, we're going to start with number 1, no forced entry. Now, in the very first paragraph of a report, Detective Arndt, who spent more time than anyone else with the Ramseys during the kidnapping phase, seems to be quite clear on this, crystal clear, in fact. She writes, on December 26, 1996, at about 06:35 hours, I received a call. And then a few lines later, she says, there was no apparent forced entry to the residence. On page 2 of Arndt's report is a second reference to no forced entry. Her source is one of the first officers responding to the scene, that's Sergeant Reichenbach. Reichenbach did a sweep of the exterior of the house and found no signs of forced entry. She writes, Sergeant Reichenbach said there was a light dusting of snow on the ground when he arrived at the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Reichenbach did not notice any footprints or other tracks in the snow. Sergeant Reichenbach personally checked the exterior of the Ramsey residence. Sergeant Reichenbach did not notice any signs of forced entry to the residence. Then there's Officer Rick French, the first responding officer. He actually went into the basement and got as far as the wine cellar. Crucially, in his initial questioning of John, both agreed that there were no obvious signs of forced entry. Listen to this. A quick inspection of the interior of the house, as well as talking to Mr. Ramsey, indicated that there was no obvious signs of a forced entry or struggle. Mr. Ramsey told me that the house appeared to be locked up as it had been left. The Ramseys have an alarm system inside of the house which is not engaged, as is normal for them. Now that's also a really interesting point where he says, as is normal for them. Now I'm not sure what that means. Does it mean it's normal that it's not engaged, or it's normal for them to have it engaged but they didn't have it engaged then? But in any event, do you think an open broken window counts as an obvious sign of forced entry? I do. And what's really interesting is Officer Rick French speaks to Mr. Ramsey, John, and John tells him that there doesn't seem to be any sign of forced entry. Here are the words. As well as talking to Mr. Ramsey, indicated that there were no obvious signs of forced entry. So if John knew about the broken window and he'd broken it and that was a possible point of entry, and all the officers are looking around the house for a sign of entry, why wouldn't you mention that? Did it just slip his mind? Now you might say, yeah, it slipped his mind. Did it slip his mind for 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and then an hour, and then waiting for the kidnapper to call? Another hour goes by, and another hour goes by, and John goes down to the basement in his own narrative and stands in front of that window, and he still doesn't mention it to the officers. And all of them have been looking for some sign of forced entry, but also just a sign of possible entry. In other words, if a door isn't locked, is it either broken or is it open? And apparently the basement window was both. So why did no one see it? So, do you think an open broken window was actually open and broken and no one noticed it? Why would no one notice it? If they notice things as subtle and specific as no footprints on the frosted walkways. There was also a photographer on scene that was also taking photos. Also, no footprints in the light dusting of snow. Even Reichenbach noticed the temperature as he was driving to the Ramsey house. I think he said it was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. How could they miss a broken window if that's what they were looking at? They were looking at windows and doors. How could they miss that? So we have 3 officers who separately and independently seem to verify the same thing. Reichenbach from the outside, French from the inside, and Arndt in terms of her interviews with both parents that there was no forced entry. There's also a 4th officer, Veach, who was outside taking photos, who didn't notice anything worth reporting. Based on this, I'm prepared to accept that when the police arrived, the basement window was neither broken nor open. And that brings us to the second point, which I think is very underappreciated and gives us deeper context into this whole question. How did the Ramseys say the intruder got in right off the bat? What was the initial intruder theory, the first intruder theory from the Ramseys themselves? Did you know from the get-go, when the cops were trying to find out how somebody could get into the house, the Ramseys seemed to think it was someone who knew them and someone who had a key. That's crucial. They thought the person who got into the house actually got in without breaking anything, just used a key. In other words, it made sense to them that there was no forced entry. And what's more, they said because they believed it to be a kidnapping, they hadn't bothered to check if there was any forced entry. Now let's go back to Arndt's report. She says, I asked Patsy if the home had an alarm system and if the alarm system had been activated on the night of December 25th. Patsy told me that the home does have an alarm system, however, it had not been used for a while. Now, it's not clear how long a while is. You would imagine if the Ramseys were about to go on vacation that they would use that alarm system. Patsy did tell me that she believed the house had been locked when she and the rest of her family went to bed on the night of December 25th. Then another section from the report, I asked Patsy who had keys to her home. Patsy said the woman who was responsible for housekeeping at her home had a key to the home. You'll notice that both Patsy and John tell the cops, as far as they know, the home was secure, buttoned up tight, with Patsy saying all doors were locked as far as she knew, and John saying he checked all the doors and windows that morning and found them locked. The point is the ransom note and an explanation that someone that knew them had a key, such as the housekeeper, was the initial explanation by the Ramseys. While this version probably floated quite convincingly in a vacuum, it popped pretty quickly upon cross-examination. The handwriting of the note wouldn't match the housekeeper, and even more elementary, she could be excluded because she had an alibi. Wasn't she at home with her husband over Christmas? And so with all of this fuss about signs of forced entry, was it not necessary? Did somebody not think, let's manufacture a sign of forced entry? What do you think about that hypothesis? Let me know in the comments, and let me know if you've ever thought about it to this point of, to some extent, complexity and, contextually. If you've listened all the way to the end of this video, high five. Thanks for your long attention span. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.